Deconverted Man here. So I had said in my video where I schooled the grade school or school project, whatever it was, might as well have been a grade school project, that I was going to talk about the outright lie in depth. And so here is me talking about the outright lie. So what is the informal fallacy outright lie? Well, what it is more properly is closer to fractal error, but that doesn't really roll off the tongue very well, and that's something that people would be like, what? It's something that just simply isn't true. Now, when we say the word lie, normally we're referring to a statement that somebody makes that they know is not true. They're deliberately trying to deceive you. You know, so and then of course people will say, well, there's white lies. Like if somebody says, do I look good in this dress? And you're like, yeah, sure. Of course you're totally lying. They look horrible in the dress, but you don't want to say that because you don't want, there to be some sort of drama. But I'm just like, yeah, no, that dress is horrible. You look horrible in that. Actually, you look horrible no matter what. So nothing you could do would make you look good. I'm sorry. Just the way it is. To my subjective opinion. You might look good to somebody else, and at this point they've already moved on because they don't like that sort of talking. That's probably why I'm single. Anyways, but an outright lie is not a deceiving sort of lie. It is simply an untruth. It isn't true in reality. So that brings us to the inevitable subject of how do we know what's true? We don't. Kind of. We can get close. Pretty dang close. But in a way, we'll never really know. At least not with the sensory inputs that we have today. Maybe future generations will have better inputs. But today, with what we've got, no. My eyes can be flawed in some way, shape, or form that I may or may not be aware of. My hearing can be flawed in some way, shape, or form. My smelling, my sense of taste, my sense of touch, and all the other zillions of senses that are often not mentioned that we have can be off in some way or another. And I might be completely unaware of how that's the case. Some people are colorblind and they're aware that they're colorblind, so they have to trust when somebody tells them that something is such and so color if to them that's just a different shade of gray. So in a social situation, we grant innocence until guilt is proven. That is to say, we don't make everyone prove every single thing that they say to us on a social level. So when I tell you that I ate breakfast yesterday, you're not going to make me prove that I ate breakfast yesterday. You're not going to demand proof, evidence, an argument, or whatever, because there's no reason to. But if I said I ate breakfast with the President of the United States yesterday, you're going to want some proof about that, because it's a claim that is rather unusual or extraordinary. So we want some proof of it. So if I say I have a roll of black tape, hey look, I have a roll of black tape. Well, that was simple. I offered you empirical evidence. So what if I don't have empirical evidence? What if it's something more abstract? Letters, numbers, words themselves, music, things like this kind of exist, but they don't really exist except in our brains. Music, you could say, well, but music exists, right? Well, kind of. It exists because we play certain things, we make sounds that travel into our ears that our brain interprets as music. But if I go bam, 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 is that music? Or is that just me going bam, 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 bam? Philosophers could debate something like that all day long. For me, it's like, yeah, it's music, whatever. I don't know. It's too vague. There's no hard definition of it, so who cares? It's a construct of our mind. So, for many things, we have just the brute fact that it is. We have the letter A is the letter A. It's just That's how it is, period. There's no argument to be given. There's no evidence. There's no repeatable test. It's just the letter A is the letter A because it's the letter A. It's that's all there is to it. So informal logic has its limitations. And so some philosopher somewhere could go trippy again and be like, well, the letter A, blah, 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 whatever, and make the letter A into a cat eventually. I don't know. But I'm not that way. I don't think about things that way. I accept that reality is real. It might not be, but I'm just going to assume that it's real. It seems pretty real to me. And then the next step is I want empirical evidence, because that's the most ready thing available to me. I want to see the thing myself. I want to be able to hold it and interact with it. And if I don't have that, and if I don't have just the brute fact of it, like a married bachelor is impossible because the definition of the words are contradictory, and the two things are individualized, separate. So we defined the word, and then we realized, well, you can't do two things at once, so I can't exist and not exist simultaneously. And hey, look, we've got something in informal logic that covers that law of identity, right? So that's where we can have the informal logic come into play. I look at informal logic as sort of a stopgap measure to save you enormous amounts of time in investigating claims to no end. Because, I mean, you could do that all day long. I would look at it another way, maybe with an analogy of the car salesman. So if you're going to a car dealership, and the car salesman, their job is to sell you that car, whatever the car is. And they're going to say and do whatever they need to say and do to sell you that car. And they might be lying all over the place to do it. So unless you independently did research on that car, you don't really have anything else to go on other than the word of the salesman, whose sole job it is to sell you that car. Of course, there's other factors to consider. The reputation of the dealership itself may be at stake, and what sort of contract you're going to have, and all of this. But if they sell you a lemon, and you have to then go to court, and then they never show up, and then they disappear, you're screwed. And sometimes that happens. So being skeptical protects you from that sort of thing. And asking for a logically coherent argument saves you that step to go through all the work and energy of researching that car yourself. It's like, okay, you want me to buy into the idea that this car is a good buy. You've got to demonstrate that it's a good car to buy. But ultimately, logic can only go so far. It has its limits. So we turn to the empirical evidence or the repeatable test because those are more solid. Those produce results. Science produces results and has continued to produce results over and over again. Whereas informal logic can only tell us to be skeptical about the conclusion or to not be skeptical about the conclusion. But it can't tell us anything more about the conclusion. Even in informal logic, it's explicitly stated that your conclusion might be false even if you had a coherent argument, but not a logically coherent argument. And you're like, what? You can structure an argument that it's okay, I said it wrong, I'm sorry. Logically sound argument versus logically coherent argument. So logically sound argument is one that all the premises are in a row, and then you've got the conclusion, yada yada yada. But it's not necessarily logically coherent because of whatever the case may be. So I might say, either I'm a human or I'm a lobster. I'm not a lobster, therefore my light is on. That was a complete non sequitur, but it was true that my light was on. But as an argument goes, you'd actually have to be skeptical because of the non sequitur that my light is on. But I don't really need the argument. All I have to do is show you that my light is on. So I don't need a logically coherent argument because I have the empirical evidence available right there. Repeatable tests, well, now you're not in the same room with me, so we can't do that. But you could perform some sort of test to see if your light is on or not. So what would happen if we had a coherent argument, that logically coherent argument, formatted right and all that, that led us to a conclusion that then we are not skeptical of? What do we do then? Well, we investigate that conclusion because we're going to want to know more about it, I would think. So how do we do that? Well, the only system that can investigate anything is the scientific one, really. So we're going to look for empirical evidence, we're going to look for the repeatable test, we're going to look for something, some way to hold, if you will, that idea. And if we find nothing, then it's more than likely that that conclusion is valid, but only in the mind and nowhere else. It's not something that exists outside of our brains. It's something that just exists as a concept. So I have not yet personally ever encountered a situation where someone has offered a logically coherent argument and then I went to investigate the conclusion and found nothing to investigate. That is, I couldn't find a test or I couldn't find empirical evidence. If the argument is logically coherent, then in every case so far that I've seen and read and heard, there's something else to back up that argument. There is a test. There is a tautology. There is a truth table. There is an empirical evidence. There's something else. And if not, it's usually a concept that we find only in the mind, like words or letters or numbers or things like that. So when someone claims to have psychic powers, for example, and you go, okay, prove it. And they say, well, but, you know, I don't need to prove it. You know, you have to take my psychic reading, you know, you have to experience it. Recall a magic bracelet salesperson who I went up to and I said, do you have any evidence that these things do anything other than just be very expensive bracelets? And she said, well, you can put it on and try it. That's not scientific evidence, because me trying it, there's a way for you to make me off balance and do this whole little gimmick that makes it seem like the bracelet's doing something when it's not. And it's been proven over and over again, these things are placebos. That's it. They don't really do anything. But they'll have the arguments, the appeal to sports, the celebrities wear these bracelets, and so on and so forth. And if you buy into that because you didn't understand logic, then you'll buy the bracelet. But if you're skeptically minded, you're like, where's your evidence? You don't have any. So where's your argument? You don't have one. So I'm going to be skeptical that this bracelet is anything other than a very expensive bracelet. That it doesn't really do any of the things that you claim it does. That it's just me thinking that it does anything that makes me feel a little bit better and maybe gives me self-confidence or whatever. But I can give myself self-confidence anyways. I don't need any external object to do that for me. If there was medicine that did that, it would be sold in a pill bottle and it would be approved by the FDA. And you might need a prescription for it. The placebo effect is powerful. So, when we go to see what is true, there's this barrier because of the way that we find out anything is with our senses ultimately. So we get more people involved. Well, isn't that logically a problem? Because it's an appeal to majority. I mean, all these scientists have looked at the same data and come to the same conclusions. But that's just an appeal to the majority, right? Yeah. But the data is there. We can see it too. We can look at that data. We'd have to understand science to understand the data, but okay. But Could we still be wrong? Maybe. And that's just unsettling for some people. A great example of this is if you do this, you're not really touching your fingers. In fact, you can't really touch anything at all. Now, there was a Vsauce video on this already that did this way better than I could. The molecules and atoms that my everything is made out of can't really touch each other. But I still feel the sensation of my skin rubbing against itself despite that. Because evolving that way enabled us to survive. That's weird, but it's true. It's counterintuitive to think that I really am never actually touching anything. It seems like I'm touching it myself, but I'm not. And of course you can do a very simple experiment where you touch your nose and you touch your toe at the same time and you feel both at the same time. But that shouldn't be. The toe should take longer to reach your brain but your brain figures out to delay the signal so that they both get there at the same time. So when you touch your toe with your finger, you feel them both at the same moment. Why? Because evolution, basically. Because being that way helped us survive somehow. So, the outright lie, going back to that, is an expression of when there is, simply put, nothing to support the idea. Here's my magic crystal ball. What makes it magic? The fact that I just said that it was magic. What's it do? Well, what's it not do? I mean, that's the question. It can do anything in my brain because I have a good imagination. But what does it really do? It doesn't do much of anything, and actually it's not even a ball, it's from a lamp. And how do I make it light up? Magic. I'm not going to tell you, but you could probably figure it out. So, if we don't have empirical evidence, we don't have a repeatable test, and we don't have a logically coherent argument, and it's not a tautology of some sort, there's no truth table, there's no anything, then the only conclusion that's reasonable is to think, well, that thing that you're talking about exists in your brain, and you can talk about it, but it's not a thing that exists out here. And that's fine. There's plenty of concepts that exist only in the brain. When you say blank is real, you have the burden to demonstrate in some way, shape, or form that insert blank is real, whatever that is. If you're unwilling or unable to do that, then we must be skeptical that blank is real. It might turn out to be that blank was real all along, but why you didn't offer us what we asked for is anybody's guess. Going back to the car salesman analogy, would you buy a car sight unseen? Everything else is in order, but the dealer just won't show you the car. They won't let you physically see the car. That's kind of weird. Why? I just want to see the car. I mean, they could give me all this document, and this is a Dark Matter video that he did a long time ago. And then they start making additional claims about the car that make it more and more ludicrous. And it's like, look, now I really just... I don't buy it. So the skeptic has to be someone who is willing to admit that in many ways we'll never really have the quote truth end quote, but in some ways we can get pretty darn close, and whatever that distance is getting better as our technology gets better, as humans change and adapt. Maybe if we start genetically engineering ourselves to have better sight and vision and so on and so forth, we'll have a better situation to deal with. And eventually philosophy might die as a result. We might not need it anymore. And some people have already said philosophy is dead. I like informal logic, and it does fall under philosophy. And if it dies, then so be it. Then I'll go with science, because it's all I'll have after that. But until that day, we have two systems that I am aware of. We have science, which I say empirical evidence, repeatable tests. I usually don't say science. Or we have informal logic. If there's some other option, then that option needs to be demonstrated to produce a result every single time. Philosophy doesn't do that. Philosophy is fun, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of philosophical concepts you could play around with all day long and be like, convince yourself that you really aren't real and that everything is made of lobsters or whatever. But as fun as that might be, as interesting as that might be, it doesn't really get us anywhere, and that's all I'm interested in. I'm interested in determining whether or not I should be skeptical of this. If you're going to present an idea and you're going to offer nothing, then I'm not going to buy it. I'm just not going to buy into that idea. And for anyone to be like, well, why do you need a logically coherent argument or empirical evidence or a repeatable test in the first place to know what's true? Because what else do we have? That's why. It's either that or I just believe what you say. And that's okay to a point. Because socially speaking, yeah, sure, I'll believe what you say. I'll believe that you ate breakfast yesterday if you tell me that. But if you tell me that you ate breakfast with the President of the United States, I'm going to want proof. If you told me that you ate the President of the United States for breakfast, I'm going to want proof so that I can get you arrested. Or probably I'm going to want nothing to do with you because I don't want to be involved with somebody that did something so weird. So, yeah. Depending on what the claim is, depending on what you say, will depend on my reaction to it. You know, I have probably over 1,000 Pokemon cards, and I could open a few Pokemon folders that I have to demonstrate that, yeah, there's probably more than 1,000. I mean, I have boxes full of folders full of Pokemon cards. But you could just take my word for it. But you don't have to. You get to be skeptical until I show you that. There's really no reason for you to be skeptical, but if you wanted to be, you could be. There's no harm in believing it, and there's no harm in disbelieving it. And you're more proper to be skeptical until I offer you one of the three things that I said: empirical evidence, repeatable test, logically coherent argument. So, whenever the outright lie calls, as annoying as it is, it's calling to remind us that reality is whatever it is, and what we discover about reality is pretty darn interesting. But we have to live with some degree of uncertainty. Those that believe in stuff that isn't scientific, that isn't logically coherent, typically don't like that because they want that thing to be true outside their own brain. And maybe it is. But I just want them to give me one of those three things. And when they don't, and when I find nothing, it's an outright lie. That's all for today. My hair is a mess. I don't care. This is Deconverted Man. And remember, unless and until we have a logically coherent argument, we must continue to be skeptical of the lobster. Wait. that's not how it goes. Oh well.